Can you give an example of your work and how it relates to the current climate crisis?
Sure. So in my lab, what we do is we try to get a better understanding of how trees and forests can resist and tolerate some climate change, some warming, some drought. So we have a bunch of students and experiments going on where either like in a greenhouse in a controlled experiment will, warm up the temperature at different levels and really track closely how different species of Acadian species we have in New Brunswick can cope to that warming to sort of identify the threshold, how resistant or resilient are tree species to the climate forecast for the next century. Um, we also look at natural forest systems. We go out in the field, we collect data and see and try to better understand how these trees have responded in the recent past to climate events to be able to better predict, future responses in this different climate that will be ours in the next decades or so.
That's super interesting. What examples of climate change have you witnessed in New Brunswick?
Well, I can give you this example of um, this Boston sudden fir mortality event that happened 3 years ago. So it's pretty new, it's pretty fresh in my mind, and we have actually some students working on this right now to better understand what happened. So in the spring of 2018, all across the province of New Brunswick, we saw some dead firs with their needles on, bright red, next to perfectly healthy firs. And this event was reported in Maine and all the way to Wisconsin, also a bit in Quebec. So there's whole lots of places that um, noticed this mortality, and in lots of places that they couldn't understand why. They didn't. They looked for insects for disease. They did find some sort of, those trees didn't seem healthy. Obviously, they were dead, but they couldn't find really what happened. And what we think happened is a severe drought the year before. Um, that might have like weakened the trees, and then there was also a spring drought at the same time, and so all these events connected to lead to this mortality event. And why I bring that up is because those droughts are expected to become more frequent and more severe with warming. Um, I mean, several times, folds more frequent. So this is an important aspect to consider. What's the long-term impact of these historically rare events that we didn't really care for? But if it happens like every other year, every 5 years now, what's going to be the impact on the forest? And that's what's predicted to happen. So it's a critical aspect that's currently happening.
Yeah, yeah, definitely for sure. We've seen a lot of those droughts even this past summer. I know there were like quite a few throughout the summer. That's
Yeah, 2020 was super dry in the Moncton area and the northwestern New Brunswick as well. Like record droughts hadn't been seen in the last like 25, 40 years or so. Yeah, so these things happen more and more, and we tend to consider them as, anecdotes, like isolated events I mean, these are anomalies, but because we live with our own timeline. We see a spring event, then the following year we tend to forget about last year's spring, and then we tend to forget about the following, and so on. But these events keep accumulating now, and they're becoming more and more frequent. And when we look at what the climate models are saying, that we're exactly going the direction the climate models had predicted. They're pretty accurate actually, and what they're saying is that this pattern will increase in frequency and in intensity, leading to some even more serious threats and damages to our environment, to our ecosystems. It impacts on agriculture, and specifically for what I'm interested in forestry. There's some trees that are not able to cope with this kind of climate that's predicted, and so what will happen then? You know, it's interesting working with trees because they have this. Um, their the life cycle is much slower than ours. Like the hemlocks here in Odell Park are like 400 years old. So what they've seen at the beginning of their life cycle was completely different than what our own experience as human beings is. You know, our own normal is, for me, that is nearly 40 years old. My own normal is what I've seen 20 years ago, you know. But for an elder 20 years ago, well, his normal or her normal will be like what happened, what was there 60 years ago, you know. So we don't see the changes with climate because our life is so short. But those changes are happening, and they're actually accelerating right now. Models predict is that, for instance, red maple is a species that is really well adapted to such warming and is predicted to increase in abundance. But there's more boreal type species, black spruce, balsam fir, etc., are expected to decline significantly with such warming. So, and other species, think about red spruce, how much, which is a keystone species of the Acadian forest, really a symbolic species. How will it cope with the warming? That's a question we're trying to tackle here in my lab. But these are all valid questions for which we don't really have yet some clear answers because it's a very complex topic. But these are the kind of urgencies, you know, that I see like that we need to address. And this is just for the forestry sector, for just the forest ecosystem, but you know, water, wildlife, biodiversity. There's all these huge questions coming up about how climate change will impact these will how climate change will change these systems. Um, there's also other threats, you know, that we don't really call climate change, that we call like global changes, including, you know, exotic pests, pathogens that come in, or even indigenous pest pathogen from south that can actually migrate towards New Brunswick because of the warming. Typically, the cold winters um, have been serving as some sort of like a border, you know, like a barricade against some of these exotic or southern pest and disease. Think about some of the ticks, you know, think about other disease like the hemlock woolly adelgid that is actually in Nova Scotia and coming into New Brunswick, that is killing all the hemlocks right now, coming from the States, originally from Japan. And what we understand is that the cold winters tend to really reduce the populations and maintain the populations of woolly adelgid at low numbers. But with the warming, we are kind of opening the door, you know, to more of this invasion, killing all the hemlocks that we have. You know, Odell Park here is perhaps the best example of an old growth hemlock forest, one of the few that we have left in the whole of Atlantic Canada. And I mean, I don't see how it can survive, you know, with this kind of threat. And we have other threats coming in. So yeah, it's about, you know, managing the risk, and we already are seeing this risk, you know, increasing and increasing. And what our data suggests that this risk is really going to increase as well in the future if we don't make some significant changes, you know, in the way, in our capacity to address these risks.
I guess that's a good segue to ask, what do you think the greatest unmet climate need is in New Brunswick?
Um, yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's a kind of a lack of acknowledgement of this risk to begin with, you know. For some of the reasons that I explained earlier, I think a lot of us are not really aware of what's been changing so far, you know. Um, like climate change is happening much faster in the north, you know, closer to the poles, and if for communities living closer to the poles, well, they're seeing lots of changes right now. For us, it's less obvious because the warming so far has been only about, you know, 1 degree or so in regions like New Brunswick. So we don't see any major trend. We see some anomalies, you know, but these anomalies are anecdotes, you know, and in a lifetime, we tend to forget about the last anomaly, like the Fort McMurray fires. Seems for everyone it happened a long time ago, you know. it was a major disaster. And the mountain pine beetle outbreak in BC, it killed like almost 50% of all the mature pine trees in that province. It's huge, and it was 10 times bigger than any mountain pine beetle outbreak before. Well, it's so far away, we tend to forget about that as well. So I think acknowledging the risk, understanding the future impacts is, and being aware of it, I think it's the first step to actually taking actions. You need everyone to be on board with this, and if we're not aware of changes to come, on, the threats, the risk, what might happen, then it's really hard to make politicians, acknowledge and take actions and make people, move out of their way to actually address these issues. And I don't, yeah, I think we need to have a better understanding of those changes to come, and a better way to, like, your initiative is good in that sense, to make people more aware of not the concept just of climate change, but what is actually down the road coming for us. It's good to be aware exactly of what the risks are. We talk a lot about climate change. Everyone has an opinion on this, and we hear columnists and opinions and how to tackle this issue, but do we really know what the issue is? What's the potential impact of this? And I don't see a lot of people, and it's fine. I mean, it's not their job to study this like my job is, so, but we need to better, spread awareness about the impacts, what the threat really is, not just opinion, like we'll be fine, I love palm trees, not this kind of short-term opinion, but actual facts, for which, politicians can base their politics on, and take real actions based on knowledgeable, not good knowledge of the information and the risks.
Great answer. Thank you. Um, as a whole, what step do you think New Brunswick citizens should take to start making a difference? Or what is one piece of advice you would give to fellow citizens?
Um, well, maybe something I find interesting is the level of engagement, of commitment of everyone, including the government, and its capacity to act when faced with an imminent threat like COVID. We've seen all the changes that happened so fast. Everybody, everybody's life was changed, and governments took actions that nobody thought they could take, closing the border, for instance, quarantine, all these things that governments took action. I think, I'm not saying this is useful in case of climate change. What I'm saying is be aware that governments can actually take some significant actions when they feel the threat, when they understand the risk, and the need for these actions. And when I compare that to the response to climate change risk, I don't see the same level of engagement, or commitment. And I don't think it's because they're bad people. I just think that a lot of us are not exactly aware of the level of threat and risk. So it's important to ask scientists to, use their leverage their knowledge. I mean, they spend an entire career. We spend our entire, adult life studying these problems. We certainly have some ideas of what's the threat and what might be some valid solutions. And this should not be something limited to, opinion makers. This should be something rooted on facts and knowledge to the best of our capacity. And then we decide as a society what to do. Do we take no action? Fine. If that's what the society wants to do, that's okay. That's a group decision, but we need first to be aware of what the impact will be. So be critical about what you see, what you hear, and evaluate the quality of the knowledge source that you're informing yourself with. Ask scientists and ask your leaders what they intend to do about climate change. Make this a more urgent matter to deal with.
That is a really great point and a really great comparison of the action that the government could take. Thank you so much for answering that question and all of the questions.